The wind howled across the barren wasteland, carrying with it the stench of decay and despair. The man trudged forward, his boots sinking into the cracked earth. He had been walking for days, maybe weeks. Time had lost all meaning in this lifeless place. His water supply was running low, and the sun burned mercilessly overhead. It was then that he saw them. A group of figures huddled together under the shadow of a crumbling rock formation. Their clothes were torn, their faces gaunt and hollow. They looked like they hadn't eaten in days. One of them, a woman with wild eyes, noticed him first. She stood up, trembling, and raised a shaky hand. "Please," she croaked, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Help us." The man hesitated. He had nothing to give them, no food, no water, no hope. But something in their eyes stopped him from walking away. They were desperate, yes, but there was also a flicker of something else. Something that reminded him of himself, long ago. He approached them slowly, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. He didn't trust easily, not in a place like this. But as he got closer, he noticed something strange. The survivors weren't just weak, they were different. Their skin had a faint, almost imperceptible glow, and their eyes seemed to reflect the light in a way that wasn't natural. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. The woman glanced at the others, then back at him. "We're lost," she said. "We've been wandering for so long. We thought we were alone." The man studied them for a moment, then made his decision. "Follow me," he said. "I know a place where you'll be safe." As they walked, the man couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into something much bigger than himself. The survivors followed him silently, their strange glow growing brighter with every step. And then, just as the sun began to set, they saw it. A hidden oasis, nestled between two towering cliffs. The water sparkled in the fading light, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. It was a paradise in the middle of hell. But as the man led the survivors closer, he couldn't help but wonder, why had no one else found this place before? The survivors gasped as they stepped into the oasis. The air was cooler here, filled with the scent of blooming flowers and fresh water. Birds chirped in the trees, and the sound of a gentle stream echoed through the valley. It was a stark contrast to the barren wasteland they had just left behind. The man watched their reactions carefully. He had seen this place many times before, but it still amazed him. The oasis was like a miracle, a small pocket of life in a dead world. But he knew better than to let his guard down. "This is incredible," one of the survivors whispered, a young man with a scar running down his cheek. "How did you find this place?" The man didn't answer right away. He walked over to the stream, knelt down, and cupped some water in his hands. It was cool and clear, just as he remembered. He drank deeply, then gestured for the others to do the same. "There's enough for everyone," he said. "But don't get too comfortable. This place, it's not what it seems." The survivors exchanged uneasy glances but didn't argue. They were too exhausted to question him. They drank from the stream, washed their faces, and collapsed onto the soft grass. For the first time in what felt like forever, they allowed themselves to relax. The man, however, remained on edge. He walked around the perimeter of the oasis, his eyes scanning the trees and cliffs. He had always felt like he was being watched here, though he could never figure out why. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the survivors gathered around a small fire the man had built. The warmth was comforting, but the mood was tense. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, the woman who had first called out to him broke the silence. "Thank you," she said softly. "You saved our lives." The man nodded but didn't look at her. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "This place, it has a way of testing people. You'll see." The survivors didn't know what to make of his words, but they were too tired to press him. They huddled together, trying to get some rest. The man stayed awake, keeping watch. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. And then, just as the fire began to die down, he heard it. A low, rumbling sound, like distant thunder. But there were no clouds in the sky. He stood up, his heart racing. "Get up," he said sharply. "Now." The survivors stirred, confused and disoriented. "What's wrong?" the young man with the scar asked. Before the man could answer, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The trees swayed violently, and the stream's water churned as if it were alive. "What's happening?" the woman cried, her voice filled with panic. The man didn't have time to explain. He grabbed her arm and pulled her to her feet. "Run," he shouted. But it was too late. The ground split open, and a blinding light erupted from the cracks. The survivors screamed as they were thrown off their feet. The man shielded his eyes, trying to make sense of what was happening. And then, through the chaos, he saw it. A figure, emerging from the light. It was tall and humanoid, but its features were blurred, as if it were made of pure energy. It moved toward them slowly, its presence both terrifying and mesmerizing. The man's mind raced. He had heard stories about this place, about the beings that guarded it. But he had always thought they were just myths. Now, he wasn't so sure. The figure stopped a few feet away from them, its glowing eyes fixed on the man. When it spoke, its voice was deep and resonant, echoing in his mind. "Why have you brought them here?" it asked. The man swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. "They needed help," he said. "I couldn't leave them to die." The figure tilted its head, as if considering his words. Then it turned to the survivors, who were cowering on the ground. "This place is not for the weak," it said. "Only those who prove themselves worthy may stay." The man's heart sank. He had brought them here to save them, but now he realized he might have doomed them instead. The figure raised its hand, and the light around them grew brighter. The survivors screamed as they were lifted into the air, their bodies glowing with the same strange energy as the figure. The man tried to reach for them, but he was frozen in place. All he could do was watch as the figure began to speak again. "The test begins now." The light faded, and the survivors were gently lowered back to the ground. They looked around, dazed and trembling, but unharmed. The figure was gone, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. The man rushed to the woman who had first called out to him. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. She nodded, though her hands were still shaking. What was that?" The man didn't have an answer. He had never seen anything like it before. He turned to the others, who were slowly getting to their feet. "We need to talk," he said. "All of you." The survivors gathered around the dying fire, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear. The man took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "This place, it's not just an oasis," he began. "It's alive. And it tests everyone who comes here." The young man with the scar frowned. "What kind of test?" "I don't know," the man admitted. "But I've heard stories. People who came here and never returned. Others who left, changed." The survivors exchanged uneasy glances. The woman spoke up, her voice trembling. "What do we do?" The man looked at each of them, his expression serious. "We stick together. And we figure out what this place wants from us." As the night wore on, the survivors began to open up about their pasts. The woman, whose name was Lena, had been a teacher before the world fell apart. She had lost her family in the chaos and had been wandering alone ever since. The young man with the scar, who introduced himself as Jax, had been a soldier. He had seen too much death and destruction, and it had left him hardened and cynical. The third survivor, an older man named Elias, had been a scientist. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were filled with regret. I thought I could save the world, he said quietly. But I only made things worse. The man listened to their stories, his heart heavy with sympathy. He had his own past, his own regrets, but he wasn't ready to share them yet. As the fire crackled softly, Lena turned to the man. "What about you?" she asked. "Why are you here?" The man hesitated, then sighed. "I was looking for something," he said. "A way to start over. But I found this place instead." Before anyone could respond, a strange sound echoed through the oasis. It was a low, melodic hum, like a song carried on the wind. The survivors looked around, their eyes wide with fear. "What's that?" Jax asked, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon he no longer carried. The man stood up, his senses on high alert. "I don't know," he said. "But we need to find out." They followed the sound, their footsteps cautious and their hearts pounding. The hum grew louder as they approached the center of the oasis, where a large, ancient tree stood. Its branches reached high into the sky, and its roots twisted deep into the earth. At the base of the tree was a small, glowing pool of water. The hum seemed to be coming from it. Lena knelt down and dipped her hand into the pool. The water was warm, and it seemed to pulse with energy. "It's beautiful," she whispered. But before anyone could react, the water began to ripple violently. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, and the ground beneath them shook. The man grabbed Lena's arm and pulled her back. "Get away from it," he shouted. But it was too late. The water erupted into a swirling vortex, and a figure emerged from its depths. It was the same figure they had seen earlier, its glowing eyes fixed on them once again. "You have been chosen," it said, its voice echoing in their minds. "But the test is not over." The survivors stared in horror as the figure raised its hand. The vortex grew larger, pulling them toward it. The man fought against the force, but it was too strong. He looked at the others, his heart filled with fear and determination. "Hold on," he shouted. "Don't let go." But one by one, the survivors were pulled into the vortex, their screams echoing through the oasis. The man was the last to go. As he was dragged into the swirling water, he caught one last glimpse of the oasis. And then, everything went black. When the man opened his eyes, he was no longer in the oasis. He found himself in a vast, dark cavern, its walls glistening with an eerie, bluish light. The air was cold and damp, and the sound of dripping water echoed in the distance. He looked around, his heart pounding. The survivors were nowhere to be seen. "Lena? Jax? Elias?" he called out, his voice echoing through the cavern. There was no response. The man took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. He had to find the others. He couldn't let them face whatever this place was alone. As he walked deeper into the cavern, he noticed strange symbols carved into the walls. They glowed faintly, pulsing with the same energy as the oasis. He didn't recognize the language, but something about the symbols made him uneasy. After what felt like hours, he finally heard a voice. It was faint, but unmistakable. "Help, please." The man's heart leapt. It was Lena. He followed the sound, his footsteps quickening. The cavern narrowed into a tunnel, and the air grew colder. The symbols on the walls became more frequent, their glow brighter. Finally, he reached a large chamber. In the center of the room was a pool of water, similar to the one in the oasis. But this pool was dark and still, its surface reflecting the dim light like a mirror. Lena was kneeling by the pool, her hands pressed against its surface. She looked up as the man entered, her eyes filled with tears. "You came," she whispered. The man rushed to her side. "Are you okay? Where are the others?" Lena shook her head. "I don't know. I woke up here, alone. I tried to find a way out, but..." Her voice trailed off as she gestured to the pool. The man looked down and saw something that made his blood run cold. Beneath the surface of the water were faces, dozens of them, frozen in expressions of fear and despair. They were the faces of people who had come to the oasis before, people who had never returned. "What is this place?" Lena asked, her voice trembling. The man didn't have an answer. He reached out to touch the water, but Lena grabbed his arm. "Don't," she said. It shows you things. Things you don't want to see." The man hesitated, then pulled his hand back. "We need to find the others," he said. "And we need to get out of here." As they turned to leave the chamber, a voice echoed through the cavern. It was deep and resonant, just like the figure they had seen in the oasis. "You cannot leave," it said. "The test is not complete." The man and Lena froze. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What do you want from us?" the man demanded, his voice filled with anger. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the ground beneath them began to shake. The pool of water rippled, and the faces beneath the surface began to move. Lena screamed as a hand reached out of the water, grabbing her ankle. The man tried to pull her away, but more hands emerged, dragging her toward the pool. "No," the man shouted, fighting against the force. But it was too strong. Lena was pulled into the water, her screams echoing through the cavern. The man fell to his knees, his heart filled with despair. He had failed her. He had failed them all. But then, something inside him snapped. He couldn't give up. Not now. He stood up, his eyes blazing with determination. "I'm not afraid of you," he shouted. "Whatever you are, you won't break me." The cavern fell silent. The hands retreated into the pool, and the water became still once again. The man took a deep breath, then turned and walked out of the chamber. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to keep moving. As he walked, he began to hear voices. They were faint at first, but they grew louder as he approached another chamber. When he entered, he saw Jax and Elias. They were standing in front of a large, glowing crystal, their faces filled with awe. "What is that?" the man asked, his voice cautious. Jax turned to him, his eyes wide. It's showing us things," he said. "Things we've lost. Things we want." The man frowned. "It's a trick," he said. "This place, it's messing with your mind." Elias shook his head. "No, it's real. It's showing me how to fix what I've done. How to make things right." The man stepped forward, his expression serious. "Listen to me. This place isn't what it seems. It's testing us, trying to break us. We need to stick together and find a way out." Jax and Elias hesitated, then nodded. They followed the man out of the chamber, their eyes filled with uncertainty. As they walked, the man couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow brighter, and the air grew colder. And then, they heard it. A low, rumbling laugh, echoing through the cavern. "You cannot escape," the voice said. "The test is not over." The man clenched his fists, his heart filled with determination. "We'll see about that," he muttered. The man led Jax and Elias through the twisting caverns, his mind racing. He knew they couldn't keep wandering aimlessly. They needed a plan, but first, they needed to understand what they were up against. As they walked, Jax broke the silence. "You seem to know more about this place than you're letting on," he said, his tone accusatory. "What aren't you telling us?" The man hesitated. He had avoided talking about his past, but now he realized he couldn't keep it hidden any longer. Not if they were going to survive. "I've been here before," he admitted, his voice low. "Not in this cavern, but in the oasis. A long time ago." Elias frowned. "What happened?" The man took a deep breath, his memories flooding back. I was like you, he began. Lost, desperate, searching for something. I stumbled upon the oasis by accident. At first, it seemed like a miracle. But then, things started to go wrong. He paused, his eyes distant. There were others with me. Friends, people I cared about. The oasis, it tested us. It showed us things, our fears, our regrets, our deepest desires. Some of us couldn't handle it. They disappeared, just like Lena. Jax's eyes narrowed. And you? Why did you survive? The man looked down, his expression grim. I don't know. Maybe because I refused to give up. Maybe because I had nothing left to lose. But I made it out. I thought I was free. But now, I realize I was wrong. Elias stepped closer, his voice filled with curiosity. What do you mean? The oasis never lets go, the man said. It stays with you, like a shadow. I thought I could leave it behind, but it brought me back. And now it's brought you here too. Jax crossed his arms, his skepticism evident. So what are we supposed to do? Just give up? No, the man said firmly. We fight. We find a way to beat this place, to break its hold on us. But to do that, we need to understand it. And we need to trust each other. The three of them fell silent, the weight of the man's words sinking in. The cavern seemed to grow darker, the symbols on the walls pulsing with an ominous glow. As they continued walking, the man's thoughts drifted back to his past. He remembered the faces of the people he had lost, the choices he had made. He had always blamed himself for what happened, but now he wondered if there was more to it. There's something else, he said suddenly, stopping in his tracks. The oasis, it's not just a place. It's alive. It feeds on our emotions, our fears. That's why it tests us. That's why it won't let us go. Jax and Elias exchanged uneasy glances. So how do we stop it? Elias asked. The man shook his head. I don't know. But I think the answer lies in the heart of this place. We need to find its source, its core. And we need to destroy it. Before anyone could respond, the ground beneath them began to shake. The walls of the cavern cracked, and the symbols glowed brighter than ever. What's happening? Jax shouted, his voice filled with panic. The man looked around, his heart racing. It knows, he said. It knows what we're planning. A loud, deafening roar echoed through the cavern, and the walls began to collapse. The man grabbed Jax and Elias, pulling them toward a narrow passageway. Run, he shouted. They sprinted through the passageway, the cavern crumbling behind them. The air was filled with dust and debris, and the sound of falling rocks was deafening. Finally, they burst into a large, open chamber. The walls were covered in glowing symbols, and in the center of the room was a massive, pulsating crystal. The man stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. This is it, he said. This is the heart of the oasis. But before they could approach the crystal, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the same glowing figure they had seen before, its eyes fixed on them with an intensity that made their blood run cold. You cannot destroy it, the figure said, its voice echoing through the chamber. The oasis is eternal. It is a part of you. The man stepped forward, his fists clenched. We'll see about that, he said. The glowing figure stood between them and the pulsating crystal, its presence both intimidating and mesmerizing. The man, Jax, and Elias froze, unsure of what to do next. The air in the chamber was thick with tension, and the symbols on the walls seemed to pulse in rhythm with the crystal. The man took a step forward, his eyes locked on the figure. We're not afraid of you, he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. We're leaving this place, and you're not going to stop us. The figure tilted its head, as if amused by his defiance. "You cannot leave," it said. "The oasis has chosen you. It will not let you go." Jax stepped up beside the man, his fists clenched. "We'll see about that," he growled. But before anyone could act, Elias suddenly moved. He darted past the man and Jax, heading straight for the crystal. His eyes were wide with a strange, almost fanatical gleam. "Elias, stop," the man shouted, but it was too late. Elias reached the crystal and placed his hands on its surface. The moment he touched it, a surge of energy erupted, sending a shockwave through the chamber. The man and Jax were thrown to the ground, their ears ringing from the blast. When the dust settled, Elias was still standing by the crystal, but something about him had changed. His eyes glowed with the same eerie light as the figure, and his expression was cold and distant. "Elias," the man called out, his voice filled with concern. Elias turned to look at them, but there was no recognition in his eyes. "This is the only way," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "The oasis will save us. It will give us what we desire." Jack scrambled to his feet, his face twisted with anger. "What are you talking about? Snap out of it." But Elias didn't respond. Instead, he raised his hand, and the crystal began to pulse faster. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, and the ground beneath them started to shake. The man realized what was happening. "He's trying to control it," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "We have to stop him." Jax didn't need to be told twice. He charged at Elias, tackling him to the ground. The two men struggled, their movements frantic and desperate. The man rushed to help, but the glowing figure stepped in his path. "You cannot interfere," it said, its voice cold and unyielding. The man glared at the figure, his anger boiling over. "Get out of my way," he shouted, shoving past it. But the figure was faster. It grabbed his arm, its grip like iron. "You do not understand," it said. "The oasis is not your enemy. It is your salvation." The man wrenched his arm free, his eyes blazing with determination. "I don't need saving," he said. "I need to get out of here." He turned back to Jax and Elias, who were still fighting. Elias had the upper hand, his strength enhanced by the crystal's energy. He pinned Jax to the ground, his glowing eyes filled with rage. "You don't understand," Elias shouted. "This is the only way." The man ran toward them, but before he could reach them, the ground beneath them split open. A deep, dark chasm appeared, separating him from Jax and Elias. "Jax," the man shouted, his voice filled with panic. Jax looked up, his eyes wide with fear. "Do something," he yelled. But there was nothing the man could do. The chasm was too wide, and the ground was still shaking. He watched in horror as Elias stood up, his expression cold and emotionless. "The oasis will save us," Elias said again, his voice echoing through the chamber. And then, before anyone could stop him, he stepped into the chasm, disappearing into the darkness below. The man and Jax stared in stunned silence, their hearts pounding. The glowing figure watched them, its expression unreadable. "The test is not over," it said. The chamber fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the pulsating crystal. The man and Jax stood on opposite sides of the chasm, their faces pale and their minds reeling from what had just happened. The glowing figure remained motionless, its eyes fixed on them. "The oasis is not what you think," it said, its voice calm but firm. "It is not a place of punishment. It is a place of transformation." The man clenched his fists, his anger boiling over. "Transformation? You call this transformation? People are dying." The figure tilted its head, as if considering his words. "Death is not the end," it said. "It is merely a step in the process. Those who are worthy will be reborn. Those who are not, will find peace." Jax, still shaken from his fight with Elias, stepped closer to the edge of the chasm. "What do you mean, worthy?" he asked, his voice trembling. The figure turned to him, its glowing eyes piercing. "The oasis tests the heart," it said. "It reveals the truth within. Those who pass the test will be granted a new beginning. Those who fail will be consumed by their own fears." The man shook his head, refusing to accept what he was hearing. "This isn't right," he said. "You're playing with people's lives. You're manipulating them." The figure's expression remained unchanged. "The oasis does not manipulate. It reveals. It shows you who you truly are." The man took a step forward, his eyes blazing with determination. "Then show me," he said. "Show me what it wants from me." The figure studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Very well." It raised its hand, and the crystal began to pulse faster. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, and the air around them seemed to shimmer. Suddenly, the man felt a strange sensation, as if the ground beneath him was dissolving. He tried to move, but his body was frozen in place. And then, the world around him changed. He was no longer in the cavern. He was standing in a familiar place, a small, quiet town surrounded by rolling hills. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over everything. The man's heart ached as he realized where he was. It was his hometown, the place he had left behind so many years ago. He walked through the streets, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The town was exactly as he remembered it, but there was something off about it. The buildings were empty, the streets deserted. And then, he saw them. A group of people standing in the town square. They were his friends, his family, the people he had lost. They turned to look at him, their faces filled with sadness. "Why did you leave us?" one of them asked, his voice filled with pain. The man's heart sank. "I didn't have a choice," he said, his voice trembling. "I had to go. I had to find a way to survive." "You abandoned us," another said. "You left us to die." The man shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't mean to," he said. I thought I could save you." But the figures didn't respond. They simply stared at him, their eyes filled with disappointment. The man fell to his knees, his heart breaking under the weight of his guilt. He had spent years running from his past, but now it was all coming back to haunt him. And then, the scene changed again. He was back in the cavern, standing in front of the glowing figure. Jax was still on the other side of the chasm, his face filled with concern. "What did you see?" Jax asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer right away. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "It showed me my past," he said finally. "My regrets. My failures." The figure nodded, as if it had expected this. "The oasis reveals the truth," it said. "It shows you what you need to see." The man looked at the figure, his eyes filled with determination. "I've seen enough," he said. "I know what I need to do." The figure tilted its head, its expression unreadable. "And what is that?" The man turned to Jax, his voice firm. "We're going to destroy this place," he said. "We're going to end this." Jax nodded, his expression filled with resolve. "I'm with you," he said. The figure watched them, its glowing eyes filled with something that almost looked like respect. "Very well," it said. "But know this, the oasis will not go quietly." The man and Jax exchanged a glance, then turned to the crystal. They knew what they had to do. The man and Jax stood before the pulsating crystal, its eerie glow casting long shadows across the chamber. The air was thick with tension, and the symbols on the walls seemed to pulse in rhythm with the crystal, as if the entire cavern was alive and watching them. The glowing figure remained motionless, its expression unreadable. "You cannot destroy it," it said, its voice calm but firm. The oasis is eternal. It is a part of you. The man ignored the figure, his focus entirely on the crystal. He turned to Jax, his voice low and urgent. We need to break it. Whatever it takes. Jax nodded, his jaw clenched with determination. What do we do? The man glanced around the chamber, his eyes scanning for anything they could use. Near the edge of the chasm, he spotted a large, jagged rock. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. There, he said, pointing to the rock. We'll use that. They hurried over to the rock, their footsteps echoing in the cavern. The glowing figure watched them but made no move to stop them. As they lifted the rock, the ground beneath them began to shake. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, and the crystal pulsed faster, as if it sensed what they were planning. Hurry, the man shouted, his voice barely audible over the rumbling. They carried the rock to the crystal, their muscles straining under its weight. The closer they got, the more intense the energy from the crystal became. It felt like they were pushing against an invisible force, one that grew stronger with every step. On 3, the man said, his voice strained. 1, 2, 3. With a final, desperate effort, they hurled the rock at the crystal. It struck the surface with a loud crack, and for a moment, nothing happened. And then, the crystal began to fracture. A web of cracks spread across its surface, and the light inside it flickered wildly. The ground shook violently, and the air was filled with a deafening roar. It's working! Jax shouted, his voice filled with hope. But the glowing figure stepped forward, its expression filled with anger. You do not understand what you are doing, it said, its voice booming. The oasis is not your enemy. It is your salvation. The man turned to the figure, his eyes blazing with determination. We don't need saving, he said. We need to be free. The figure raised its hand, and a surge of energy erupted from the crystal. The man and Jax were thrown backward, their bodies slamming into the ground. The man groaned, his vision blurry. He could feel the energy from the crystal pressing down on him, trying to crush him. But he refused to give up. He struggled to his feet, his body trembling with effort. Jax, he shouted. We're not done yet. Jax, battered but still determined, got to his feet as well. What do we do now? He asked, his voice filled with desperation. The man looked around, his mind racing. And then, he saw it. Near the edge of the chasm was a smaller crystal, its glow faint but steady. It was connected to the larger crystal by a thin, glowing thread. That's it, the man said, his voice filled with urgency. That's the source. We need to destroy it. They ran toward the smaller crystal, the ground shaking violently beneath them. The glowing figure tried to stop them, but its movements were slow and unsteady, as if it was losing its power. When they reached the smaller crystal, the man grabbed a loose rock from the ground. This ends now, he said, his voice filled with resolve. He raised the rock and brought it down on the crystal with all his strength. It shattered on impact, the light inside it flickering and fading. The larger crystal let out a deafening roar, its light growing brighter and brighter. And then, with a final, blinding flash, it exploded. The man and Jax were thrown to the ground, their bodies battered and bruised. The cavern around them began to collapse, the walls crumbling and the symbols fading. The glowing figure stood in the center of the chaos, its form flickering like a dying flame. You have made your choice, it said, its voice filled with sorrow. But know this, the oasis will always be a part of you. And then, it was gone. The man and Jax struggled to their feet, their bodies aching but their spirits unbroken. The cavern was collapsing around them, and they knew they had to get out. This way, the man shouted, leading Jax toward a narrow passageway. They ran through the passageway, the ground shaking and the walls crumbling behind them. The air was filled with dust and debris, and the sound of falling rocks was deafening. Finally, they burst out of the cavern and into the open air. The sun was rising, casting a warm golden light over the barren wasteland. The man and Jax collapsed onto the ground, their bodies exhausted but their hearts filled with relief. "We did it," Jax said, his voice filled with disbelief. "We actually did it." The man nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Yeah," he said. "We did." But as they sat there, catching their breath, the man couldn't shake the feeling that the glowing figure's words still lingered in his mind. "The oasis will always be a part of you." The sun rose higher in the sky, its warm light bathing the barren wasteland in a golden glow. The man and Jack sat in silence, their bodies battered but their spirits unbroken. The oasis was gone, its hold on them finally broken. Jax was the first to speak. "What now?" he asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. The man looked out at the horizon, his expression thoughtful. "We keep going," he said. "We find a way to start over." Jax nodded, but his eyes were filled with doubt. "After everything we've been through, do you think we can?" The man turned to him, his gaze steady. "We have to," he said. "The oasis tested us, but it didn't break us. That means something." Jax didn't respond right away. He looked down at his hands, his mind racing with thoughts of everything they had lost. Lena, Elias, the others, they were gone, and nothing could bring them back. I don't know if I can move on," Jax admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The man placed a hand on his shoulder, his touch firm but comforting. "You don't have to forget them," he said. "But you can't let their loss define you. You have to keep living, for their sake and for yours." Jax looked up, his eyes filled with tears. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you keep going after everything you've been through?" The man sighed, his gaze drifting back to the horizon. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do know this: life is about more than just surviving. It's about finding something worth fighting for, even when it feels like there's nothing left." Jax nodded slowly, his expression filled with determination. "You're right," he said. "We've come this far. We can't give up now." The man smiled, a rare but genuine expression of hope. "That's the spirit," he said. As they sat there, the silence between them was filled with a sense of peace. The weight of the oasis was gone, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they felt free. After a while, the man stood up, brushing the dust off his clothes. "We should get moving," he said. "There's still a long way to go." Jax got to his feet as well, his movements slow but steady. "Where are we going?" he asked. The man looked out at the horizon, his eyes filled with determination. "Somewhere better," he said. "Somewhere we can start over." They began to walk, their footsteps slow but purposeful. The wasteland stretched out before them, vast and unforgiving, but they didn't let it deter them. They had faced worse, and they had come out stronger. As they walked, the man couldn't help but think about the glowing figure's final words. "The oasis will always be a part of you." At first, the thought had filled him with dread, but now he realized it wasn't a curse. It was a reminder of everything they had been through, everything they had overcome. The oasis had tested them, but it had also shown them the strength they didn't know they had. It had revealed their fears, their regrets, and their deepest desires, but it had also shown them the power of hope, resilience, and the human spirit. And as they walked into the unknown, the man knew they would carry that strength with them, no matter where life took them next. The lesson. The story of the oasis is a reminder that life is full of challenges, but it is also full of opportunities. It is a test of our strength, our resilience, and our ability to find hope in the darkest of times. The man and Jax faced unimaginable trials, but they refused to give up. They learned that the past cannot be changed, but the future is always within our grasp. They discovered that true strength lies not in avoiding pain, but in facing it head-on and emerging stronger on the other side. And most importantly, they learned that no matter how lost we may feel, there is always a way forward. We just have to keep moving, one step at a time. The oasis may be gone, but its lessons will live on, not as a burden, but as a beacon of hope, guiding us toward a brighter tomorrow.